Sharing a sandwich is a universally human gesture. I simply didn't expect a pastrami on rye to prevent an interstellar war. If I had known the shivering four-armed kid hiding in Terminal 4 was the heir to the Vesperi Empire, I probably would have offered her the chips too. Port Jericho was the kind of deep space transit hub where dreams went to die and cargo haulers went to lose their credits. I had been stranded there for 36 hours, courtesy of a blown coupling on the SS Bradbury, a rust bucket freighter operated by Grayson and Miller Logistics. As a senior agricultural engineer, my job was to fix atmospheric scrubbers on newly seeded colonies, not sit on a sticky plastic steel bench smelling aerosolized engine grease and cheap synthetic noodles. My stomach gave a hollow, aching rumble, reminding me I hadn't eaten since the previous cycle. With a weary sigh, I hoisted my heavy canvas tool duffel over my shoulder and made my way toward the promenade. After 20 minutes of navigating a sea of multi-limbed, chitinous and tentacled travelers, I found a vendor kiosk run by a guy named Tommy, a fellow Terran who managed to import actual Earth-grown supplies. It cost me nearly 2 days' wages, but I bought a heavily layered pastrami sandwich on rye, complete with sharp mustard and a side of salted potato crisps. It was a taste of home, something I desperately needed in this miserable corner of the Perseus Arm. I found a quiet alcove near the maintenance bays of Terminal 4, away from the glaring neon advertisements for off-world casinos. I sat down on a crate of industrial solvent, unwrapped the crinkling foil, and took a deep breath of the spiced smoked meat. It was heaven. I was about to take my first bite when I heard a faint rhythmic clicking sound, like claws nervously tapping against a ventilation grate. I paused, lowering the sandwich. Peering into the shadowy recess between the bulkhead and a row of out-of-service ticketing kiosks, I saw a pair of massive, luminous golden eyes staring back at me. "Hey there," I muttered, my voice low and non-threatening. The eyes blinked. A small figure shrank further back into the shadows. As my eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, I made out her features. She was a Vesperia species known for their rigid caste system, their terrifying naval armada, and their general disdain for humanity. But this wasn't some haughty diplomat. This was a child. She had 4 slender arms, currently wrapped tightly around her knees, and her skin was covered in fine indigo scales that looked dull and ashen, a clear sign of severe dehydration. Her silken, high-collar garments, clearly expensive, were torn and stained with what looked like engine coolant. She was trembling violently. I looked at my pastrami sandwich. I looked at the kid. Then I sighed. Humanity has a fatal flaw, one that every other species in the galaxy finds utterly baffling. We will pack bond with literally anything if it looks sad enough. I slowly broke the sandwich in half. I didn't stand up or make any sudden movements. I just slid the foil wrapper across the grimy floorboards, stopping about 2 feet away from her hiding spot. "Go ahead," I said softly, taking a bite of my own half to prove it wasn't poisoned. "It's pastrami. Cures just about anything." She didn't move for a long minute. Then the lower left arm cautiously extended from the darkness. Her 3-fingered hand snatched the foil, yanking it back into the shadows. I heard a soft sniffing sound followed by the rapid, desperate chewing of a creature that was absolutely starving. The sharp Terran mustard had to be a shock to her alien palate, but she devoured the food in seconds. "Slow down, kid," I murmured, unscrewing the cap from my canteen. I slid the water bottle over just as I had the sandwich. She grabbed it, drinking greedily. As she drank, I noticed something chilling. 2 imposing figures had just entered the concourse from the main promenade. They were Crinan mercenaries hulking, grey-skinned brutes often hired by cartels and shadow corporations for off-the-books violence. They were actively scanning the crowd, holding what looked like biometric trackers. They shoved a passing merchant against a wall, peering into his cargo cart before violently moving on. They were hunting, and based on the way the little indigo girl let out a terrified whimper and curled into a tight ball, I knew exactly what their prey was. I didn't know the politics. I didn't care what cartel she belonged to or what she had stolen. All I saw was a frightened, starving kid and 2 heavily armed thugs actively ignoring Spaceport Authority regulations. I shifted my weight, casually sliding my heavy canvas tool duffel to block the gap between the kiosks. I leaned back, stretching my legs out, effectively obscuring the shadows behind me with my own bulky frame. I unclipped the heavy, solid titanium hydrospanner from my belt and rested it quietly on my thigh, hidden beneath my jacket. "Stay completely still," I whispered to the shadows without turning my head. "Don't make a sound. Panic is a funny thing. Other species freeze, or their secondary hearts give out, or they excrete defensive odors. Humans, our adrenal glands flood our systems with a chemical cocktail that turns off pain receptors and sharply narrows our focus." As the two Crinan mercenaries approached my alcove, my heart rate steadied into a heavy, rhythmic thump. The lead mercenary stopped about 5 feet from me. He was easily 7 feet tall, wearing battered ablative armor and carrying a low-frequency plasma baton on his hip. His flat, reptilian snout flared as his biometric tracker beeped rapidly. His cold, slitted eyes slowly dropped from his screen to me. "Move, Terran," he rumbled in heavily accented galactic common. His voice sounded like grinding stones. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before I swallowed. "Public concourse, pal. I paid my transit tax. I'll sit where I want." The mercenary's eyes narrowed. In the broader galactic community, humans were generally considered a mid-tier species. We weren't the smartest, we didn't live the longest, and we certainly didn't have the biggest ships. But we evolved on a high-gravity death world. Our bone density and muscle mass made us surprisingly heavy, and our endurance was legendary. To a Crinan, though, I just looked like a soft, squishy biped in a grease-stained mechanic's jacket. "You're obstructing," the second mercenary hissed, stepping forward. He reached a massive, clawed hand toward my shoulder to toss me aside. He never made contact. I planted my boot, twisted my hips, and swung the heavy titanium hydrospanner upward in a tight, brutal arc. The solid metal connected directly with the joint of the mercenary's extending elbow. There was a sickening crack as his arm bent backward at a completely unnatural angle. The alien shrieked, stumbling back. The lead mercenary roared, reaching for his plasma baton. I didn't give him the chance to draw it. I dropped my sandwich and drove my shoulder directly into his midsection. It was a maneuver borrowed from an old Earth sport called rugby. My mass, combined with the explosive kinetic energy of a human adrenaline spike, lifted the 7-foot alien completely off his feet. We crashed backward into the plasti-steel wall of the concourse. The air left his lungs in a violent whoosh. Before he could recover, I brought the butt of my hydrospanner down hard against his temple. His eyes rolled back, and he slumped heavily to the floor. Alarms immediately began to blare. Flashing crimson emergency lights bathed the terminal in a harsh red glow. "Hey, kid!" I yelled, turning back to the shadows. "We gotta go. Now! Now!" The little Vesperi girl scrambled out of the darkness. She was terrified, but she was fast. I grabbed my tool duffel, hooked my free hand around one of her upper arms, and dragged her toward the maintenance access doors. A standard electronic lock stood in our way. I bypassed the keypad entirely, using the hydrospanner to smash the casing, then bridged the exposed wires with a pair of insulated pliers. The heavy blast doors hissed open, and we ducked inside just as spaceport security drones began swarming the concourse behind us. We were in the bowels of Port Jericho. It was a labyrinth of steam pipes, coolant lines, and humming power conduits. It was exactly the kind of environment I worked in every day. I knew these layouts. I knew where the blind spots were. We ran, or rather I ran, and the girl easily kept pace with a strange, fluid grace, her forearms helping her balance as we scrambled over massive venting ducts. After 20 minutes of winding through the claustrophobic darkness, we stopped in a disused pump room. I leaned against a rusted bulkhead, panting heavily, sweat stinging my eyes. The little girl stood a few feet away, watching me intently. Her breathing was entirely normal. "You fight like a frontline shock trooper," she said. Her galactic common was incredibly refined, carrying an aristocratic lilt that completely contradicted her ragged appearance. "I'm a tractor mechanic," I wheezed, wiping my forehead with the back of my sleeve. "Arthur Pendleton. What's your name, kid? And why exactly is the Kalen Syndicate trying to bag you?" She stood up a little straighter, brushing some of the grime from her torn silk garments. Even covered in dirt, she managed to project an aura of absolute authority. "I am Lesan, and they are hunting me because 3 solar cycles ago my uncle initiated a bloody coup against my mother's throne. I was smuggled off-world to keep the royal bloodline safe. I stared at her. Your mother's throne. You're a princess? I am the sole heir apparent to the Vesperi stellar empire, Leah stated, her golden eyes flashing with a sudden fierce pride. And you, Arthur Pendleton, just assaulted 2 mercenaries hired by the usurper before I could fully process the fact that I had just forcefully inserted myself into the middle of a galactic civil war. The entire spaceport violently lurched. A deafening low-frequency roar echoed through the metal hull of the station, vibrating in my teeth. The overhead lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim amber glow of emergency backups. What was that? I demanded, grabbing my duffel. A hull breach. Leah looked up toward the ceiling, a complicated expression crossing her scaly features, a mixture of relief and absolute terror. No, she whispered, that is a Vesperi dreadnought entering the atmosphere. My mother has found me, and she's going to burn this entire spaceport to ash to get me back. Dust rained down from the corroded overhead pipes, coating my greasy jacket in a fine gray film. The entire maintenance sublevel groaned under the immense gravitational displacement of the ship outside. I wiped the grime from my eyes and looked down at Leah, whose golden eyes were fixed on a small, battered datapad she had pulled from a hidden pocket in her silken tunic. That is not my mother, Leah whispered, her voice trembling so violently that the device in her lower hands rattled. I stopped wrapping a piece of electrical tape around my hydrospanner and frowned. You just said a Vesperi dreadnought was entering the atmosphere to burn this place down. If it's not the Queen, who is it? Leah's forehands tightened around the datapad. The engine resonance is all wrong for the royal flagship. This is a retrofitted heavy cruiser. It belongs to Hector, my uncle, the usurper. She looked up at me, the aristocratic mask crumbling to reveal a terrified little girl. He didn't send mercenaries to capture me, Arthur. He sent them to track me. He brought his own fleet to execute me. I cursed under my breath, a colorful string of blue-collar expletives that I had picked up working the orbital rig circuits. I reached into my canvas duffel and started taking inventory. I wasn't a soldier. I was an agricultural engineer employed by Grayson and Miller Logistics, a company too cheap to spring for hazard pay, let alone combat training. My weapons consisted of a genuine, Earth-manufactured snap-on heavy-duty plasma cutter, a few spools of high-tensile copper wiring, and a half-empty can of industrial degreaser. All right, here is the reality of our situation, kid, I said, crouching down to her eye level. I needed to balance empathy with the cold, hard facts of our survival. We are trapped in a decaying transit hub that is currently being boarded by a hostile military force. I don't have a blaster, and you don't have an army. But what I do have is 30 years of experience ripping apart and rebuilding colonial life support systems built by Caterpillar and Boeing. I know how this station breathes. And right now we are going to make it choke. Leah nodded slowly, her posture straightening as she drew on her royal conditioning. What is our tactical objective, Arthur Pendleton? We get to the cargo bays, I said, pointing down the dimly lit service tunnel. My ship, the SS Bradbury, is docked at Bay 42. It's a rust bucket, but its navigational computer is offline, meaning it can't be remotely locked down by the spaceport's mainframe. If we can bypass the manual launch camps, we can punch a hole through the blockade before Hector's sensors even register a launch. We move quickly but silently. The bowels of Port Jericho were a maze of high-pressure steam conduits and cryogenic coolant lines. I led the way, using the heavy titanium spanner to test the floor plating before we stepped. Above us, the muffled sounds of systematic execution echoed through the ventilation shafts. Hector's death squads were purging the public concourses, leaving no witnesses who might report the presence of the Vesperi Hare. 10 minutes into our ascent toward the cargo bays, my internal comms unit crackled to life. It was a proximity frequency, unencrypted. Sector 4 secure, each signatures detected in the primary coolant manifold. Moving to intercept. The voice was harsh, modulated by a tactical helmet. They had thermal scanners. They're coming, Leah breathed, pressing her back against a massive, humming power relay. 4 of them, heavily armored. Get behind the relay, I ordered, my hands moving with practiced frantic precision. I pulled the snap-on plasma cutter from my bag and dialed the thermal output to maximum. ignoring the safety warnings flashing on the LED display. I wedged the cutter beneath a massive, pressurized valve marked with hazard symbols for caustic ammonia coolant. I grabbed a spool of copper wire, tied one end to the cutter's ignition trigger, and spooled it out as I backed away, hiding behind a reinforced support pillar opposite Lear. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy blast doors at the end of the corridor hissed open. 4 of Hector's elite shock troopers stepped through. They wore heavy kinetic armor painted in the stark ash-gray colors of the usurper's house. The squad leader, a towering brute holding a rapid-fire plasma repeater, scanned the room with a laser-sighted optic. "Target is behind the central relay," the leader barked in Galactic Common. "Take the human alive, if possible. Kill the hare." They fanned out, their heavy boots clanking against the metal grating. I waited until the squad leader was exactly parallel to the caustic ammonia valve. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just yanked the copper wire with everything I had. The plasma cutter ignited with a blinding blue flash, instantly melting through the rusted locking mechanism of the pressure valve. Physics did the rest. A highly pressurized geyser of sub-zero caustic ammonia erupted into the corridor. The sheer force of the blast threw 2 of the troopers against the wall, their armor instantly freezing and cracking under the extreme thermal shock. The squad leader shrieked as the chemical cloud enveloped him, corroding the seals on his helmet and blinding his optics. "Run!" I yelled to Lear. We sprinted through the expanding cloud of freezing vapor. One of the surviving troopers, firing blindly, sent a barrage of plasma bolts down the corridor. One of the superheated projectiles grazed my left thigh. The pain was instantaneous and absolute, a searing, localized agony that smelled of burnt denim and charred flesh. My leg buckled, and I crashed hard onto the grating. I gritted my teeth, suppressing a scream. Before I could push myself up, small, strong hands were grabbing the collar of my jacket. La, using all 4 of her arms, hauled me upright with surprising strength. "Do not falter, Arthur," she commanded, her voice ringing with desperate authority. "The cargo bay is through the next bulkhead." I limped heavily, leaning my weight against the young princess. We stumbled through the heavy security doors, hitting the emergency lock override just as the surviving troopers began to pursue us. I collapsed against the cold steel of the door, ripping open a foil med patch from my jacket and slapping it over the plasma burn. The localized anesthetics flooded my leg, dulling the agony to a dull, throbbing ache. We had made it to Cargo Bay 42. But my momentary relief shattered instantly. The SS Bradbury was docked at the far end of the cavernous hangar, but standing between us and my ship was a platoon of 20 shock troopers, led by a massive, scarred commander whose armor bore the golden insignia of Hector's personal guard. His nameplate read, "Briggs, a brutal mercenary captain known throughout the sector for his ruthlessness." They had bypassed the maintenance tunnels and come straight through the main promenade. We were completely cut off. Briggs slowly clapped his gauntleted hands, the sound echoing mockingly through the massive, empty hangar. "Well fought, mechanic. You possess a surprising amount of grit for a Terran grease monkey. But the game is over. Hand over the girl." I pushed myself off the blast door, gripping my titanium spanner so hard my knuckles turned white. My legs screamed in protest, but I stood between Lear and the platoon. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the only other thing I had left, a crushed, greasy Ziploc bag containing the remaining crumbs of the pastrami sandwich. It was a pathetic sight, a stark reminder of how hopelessly outgunned we were. "You listen to me, Briggs," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am an official contractor for Grayson and Miller, protected under the Terran Trade Accord. You fire on me and you're starting a diplomatic incident that your usurper boss cannot afford." Briggs threw his head back and laughed. "The Terran Trade Accord. Down here in the dark human, nobody cares about your treaties. Kill the mechanic. Bring me the hare's head." The platoon raised their rifles. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. I had done my best. I had shared my lunch, and I had fought for a kid who needed me. It was a decent way to go out. But the plasma fire never came. Instead, the very fabric of space inside the hangar seemed to tear open. A deafening, localized sonic boom shattered the heavy plexiglass observation windows high above us. The massive, heavily reinforced hangar doors, built to withstand orbital debris impacts, were suddenly ripped off their hinges as if they were made of tinfoil. A ship hovered in the opening. It wasn't a retrofitted cruiser. It was a leviathan of polished white armor and glowing blue energy arrays. It was the absolute pinnacle of interstellar engineering, the true Vesperi royal flagship. Before Briggs or his men could react, dozens of drop pods smashed through the ceiling of the hangar, cratering the concrete floor. From the dust and debris emerged the Queen's elite Praetorian Guard. They didn't use plasma rifles. They wielded crackling, high-frequency energy halberds that sliced through Hector's shock troopers like a hot knife through butter. In less than 45 seconds, the platoon that had cornered us was completely dismantled. Briggs was on his knees, surrounded by 4 Praetorians, his weapons stripped. The dust began to settle. From the ramp of the hovering flagship, a figure descended. She was at least 8 feet tall, adorned in flowing robes of luminescent white and gold. Her 4 arms were resting gracefully at her sides, but her golden eyes radiated a cold, terrifying fury that could freeze a star. She was Queen Margaret, the sovereign of the Vesperi Empire. She glided across the hangar floor, ignoring the carnage, her eyes locked entirely on Leah. When she was 10 feet away, she stopped. The cold fury melted away, replaced by an overwhelming, desperate relief. "My daughter," Queen Margaret whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 worlds. Leah broke away from my side and ran to her mother, burying her face in the royal robes. The Queen wrapped all 4 arms around her child, closing her eyes as a single, silver tear fell down her scaled cheek. For a long moment, the hangar was completely silent save for the humming at the flagship's engines. Then the Queen's golden eyes opened and locked onto me. I was a mess covered in grease, bleeding from a plasma burn, leaning heavily on a bloody titanium wrench and holding a dirty Ziploc bag. "And who," the Queen asked, her voice returning to its regal, commanding resonance, "is this human?" "Was he holding you hostage, Liz?" And 2 Praetorian guards immediately stepped forward, their energy halberds lowering toward my chest. I didn't have the strength left to lift my spanner. "No!" Liz shouted, stepping out from her mother's embrace and placing herself firmly between me and the guards. "He is Arthur Pendleton. He is a tractor mechanic, and he saved my life." The Queen looked at me, scanning my battered form. "He fought off Hector's vanguard?" "A simple laborer." "Yes," Leah said, her voice filled with fierce pride. She turned to me and gently took the crushed Ziploc bag from my trembling hand. She held it up toward her mother like it was a sacred relic. "I was starving in the shadows, Mother. I was terrified. No one in this entire spaceport would look at me. But Arthur found me. He didn't ask for credits. He didn't care about the bounty on my head. He just saw that I was hungry." She pointed to the greasy foil wrapper visible inside the plastic. "He shared his pastrami with me." Queen Margaret stared at the crumpled bag. For a species built on strict caste systems, ruthless military conquests, and zero-sum diplomacy, the concept of purely altruistic charity from a stranger was entirely alien. She looked from the bag to my exhausted, soot-covered face. The sovereign of the Vesperi Empire slowly approached me. The Praetorian guards parted respectfully. She stopped just inches away, her massive frame towering over me. Slowly, she extended her upper right hand and placed 2 long, elegant fingers against my chest, right over my heart. "You humans are a baffling anomaly," Queen Margaret said softly. "You possess bodies soft enough to be pierced by mere shrapnel, yet you harbor a ferocity that rivals our greatest warlords. And you wield it not for conquest, but for the sake of a child who is not even of your own kind." She stepped back, sweeping her arms wide in a formal gesture of absolute respect. "Arthur Pendleton, the Vesperi Empire is in your debt. You shall never want the credits, nor shall your employers ever struggle for contracts within our borders again." She offered a small, knowing smile. "And I will ensure that Port Jericho imports the finest pastrami the galaxy has to offer." I finally let my hydro spanner drop to the floor with a heavy clatter. I let out a long, shuddering breath, a tired smile cracking through the dirt on my face. "I'd appreciate that, Your Majesty. Just make sure they include the sharp mustard." In the end, it wasn't our dreadnoughts or our diplomats that secured humanity's place in the galaxy. It was a greasy foil wrapper, a half-eaten sandwich, and the simple instinct to protect the vulnerable. Queen Margaret learned that day what it means to be human. We fight like demons, but only because we care. Sometimes all it takes to forge an interstellar alliance is a shared lunch.